Now we're recording, and now we're live, so we're able to talk. Mohammed, would you like to introduce the guest?
Yes, good evening. Welcome to our everyday politics show this evening. Tonight we have Louis Eves, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield, Hallam. He's specializing in security studies. We're having him here to discuss with us the topic for tonight, which is the securitization of COVID-19. Louis, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on the show.
Also, we have Rabi Abdul Samad, who is the co-presenter of the program. Welcome too.
Thank you. Welcome, Louis.
I'm going to go into the first question of the program. Is COVID-19 a security issue, a security threat, a national security concern, as most states/nations perceive, or is COVID-19 an opportunity for multilateral cooperation, as the UN chiefs perceive, or Assad, namely the Secretary General Guterres and the Secretary of World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros. They claim that, or they persist that it is time for multilateral cooperations. However, nations and states have shown concern that this is a real security issue that needs to be handled with a lot of care. So, which is which?
Okay, I think that's an interesting question, because clearly people are turning to their national governments for protection from the coronavirus, as they might do with more traditional concerns such as war. And at the same time, national governments are consistently employing the language of traditional security when talking about COVID-19, using terms like the front line when describing medical staff or talking about the national battle against the virus. But I think it's a trap to get into that binary to say that COVID-19 is not a, COVID-19 can be both a national security concern for states on a case-by-case basis, but also be an opportunity for cooperation. And if we draw upon the work of the likes of Hedley Bull, who's from the English school, who argues that we can establish international norms and an international society of cooperation based on familiarity and trust. And I think COVID-19 is seeing governments cooperate with one another on a greater level. That is possibly where that trust can begin to then be sustainable and be there post-pandemic. A particular example from that comes from Sino-Japanese relations. So China and Japan have a rocky relationship for various reasons. In the last 10 years, there have been incidents over territorial disputes in the East China Sea, with both sides deploying ships to the region. But over the last few months, Japan's been giving PPE to China, and China's been providing Japan with COVID-19 tests, and they've been cooperating on a much deeper level than they have been for quite a while, which I think is an example of how that familiarity and trust can be being built. And you see another example with the European Union and the European Union, the EU's medical protection and equipment scheme, where they're using their collective power to bulk buy PPE and ventilators. And that is another example of cooperation that can possibly deepen the union of European integration. I mean, obviously there are examples such as the UK not participating in the EU scheme, which is an example of domestic politics getting in the way of what could be cooperation, damaging that trust. But being an optimist, I'm kind of erring on the side of a lot of countries could build on this experience to cooperate more in the future. So definitely it can be a national security issue, but countries are cooperating because it's a shared issue. And just to finish that off, Chinese and Japanese politicians have actually been quoting their history a lot recently. So a Japanese emperor, a Japanese emperor once gave a poem to a Chinese monk, and I'll get the exact quote. It said, "Even though we live in different places, we live under the same sky," which is kind of apt for security concerns because you might be in different countries, but you're all facing the same issue here.
Very good ending to that question. If you look at Donald Trump's claims that he's saying that I'm a sitting president who he's likening COVID-19 to a war. So, and he's actually adopted this position of securitizing it, saying that it's secure. And also, you can see that some of the comments he used, this China's virus, kind of like pushing the blame to target, which is China, for example. You can you see like the talk of President Trump?
Yeah, and I think a key point here is that a security issue might be something that's perceived as really important to address, but no security issue exists in isolation. So COVID-19 is occurring within the context of competition between the US and China, as you can see in the US-China trade war, and that's the backdrop in those countries' relationships. So with Donald Trump framing COVID-19 within that context, you can actually start to get an idea of what the American administration's sort of hierarchy of security threats is, where perhaps COVID-19's here on its list of priorities, but actually competition with China's here. So COVID-19 exists within that overarching security context.
And also, if you look at unilateralism versus multilateralism, we've seen a number of times the United States of America's president, Donald Trump, showing a very bad relationship with the WHO's chief. They kind of like had a number of disagreements on how to go forward with a like more collaborative. When Donald Trump seems to be like going it alone, which is very hard in this circumstance. There is no one single nation that can do it alone, because it's a global issue, it's a global concern, and it requires a global effort. Yeah, do you think that the unilateralism of Donald Trump at the moment is actually putting a lot in jeopardy?
Yeah, so I agree with you that it's problematic because, as you said, global issues require a global response, and nation states trying to go it alone sort of throws a spanner in the works. The issue here is that security is, as a concept, is inherently externalized. So if you go back to those traditional ideas that security is all about war and conflict, it's very easy to externalize that other as a different community that you're fighting with, someone different to you. And for somebody like Donald Trump, whose foreign policy, as you can see over the last few years, is very much based on like more traditional notions of security, I'm not necessarily surprised that their COVID-19 response is heavily externalized in the same way. But that is also just a phenomenon related with security politics, so it isn't necessarily unexpected in just the realm of security studies either.
Just to top up on Lewis's point, the whole issue with COVID-19, it could have all ended within the first couple of weeks in March if all the world decided to apply a a quarantine for 40 days where people wouldn't leave the house, and they slowed the economy down for just 40 days. They could have limited the spread of COVID-19 forever by stopping it in its track. But I think the non-collaboration, non-cooperation stance that each nation is going by, such as Brazil or the United States, and there's a few others, that really affected them a lot, but by not allowing them to grow any further, and by it basically affected their economy much worse, way worse than it would have been if they did rely on collaborating with other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to comment in terms of what we could have done differently with regards specifically to the spread of the virus, because I'm not an expert in biohazards Securitization and sort of security studies is more my background, and I'm also not particularly an expert in economics to comment on what the economic impact might have been had things been done differently. But in what I can comment on is with regards to what you said about that sort of global level response and coordination between states, and sort of linking back to the question being about nation states and is it a national security issue. While it is a national security issue, and it's also a multinational issue, and coordination between states would be necessary rather than a sort of pitch patch of cooperations. But that cooperation could be leading towards future multilateralism and multinational corporations and organizations being able to take the lead should this arise again in the future.
I've realized this, and the reason I talked about the economic similarities is because you can see the case of New Zealand, where they actually did risk their economy for a short time and did complete quarantine, and they were able to open, and their economy increased benefitably. It benefited a lot from the zero cases that took place for a really long while. And I think their economic benefit came from them doing a complete lockdown. And because it's an island, it's easier than countries such as, I don't know, Azerbaijan or other nations around the world. But the reason that the United States, I disagreed on it, and I highlighted on it, is because you can see two conflicting cases, which is New Zealand and Brazil, and the United States as well, which both had different strategies to it. And I relied my economic points based on that. Sorry, Mohammed.
I think there is an issue to do with strategic failure. Most of the strategies pursued, particularly here in the UK, were not robust enough to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Has been highlighted. There's disagreement on so far the performance of the current government and how it handled COVID-19. So is also the situation in many countries, and it's very hard to kind of like align different states' strategies to bring a single objective. It's normally difficult because when you are dealing with state nations, the territorial jurisdiction, they normally do their own planning, their own strategies of how to handle. So some states were more effective than others, and hopefully, I think multilateralism will be boosted because this is a pandemic that requires transnational efforts, which transcends national boundaries. And I think in the long term, a lot of states that had, like Lewis stated, states that which had a bad relationship or very cold relationship might end up having a warm relationship, like it has come out with the Sino-Japanese relationship. Moving on to our next question, our second question is, COVID-19 is a security term for who?
So COVID-19 poses a tangible health risk to people who are elderly, those with underlying health conditions, those from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think that's not disputable. With regards to it being a security threat, that's a little bit more complicated. It's not quite a yes/no question. This is because security is a social phenomenon with particular connotations. I said earlier about security being particularly external, for example, or existential and externalized. In order to achieve security status, an issue has to go through a securitization process in which a social elite invokes security, invokes a community's subjective values in a securitizing move, normally a speech, and frames it as an existential threat to an object that that community holds dear. So if we look at speeches that have been made in the UK, Dominic Raab, in April, he framed COVID-19 as a security threat to individual health and also public institutions. And he said, in doing so, he said, we need to protect the NHS and save lives, which would then suggest that COVID-19 is a security threat for individuals and the National Health Service. But then if we look at, say, Serbia, President Vucic, and I excuse my pronunciation if I've slaughtered that name there, he framed COVID-19 as a threat to the Serbian nation. He invoked nationalistic sentiment in his speeches, saying that COVID-19 is a threat to Serbia, and we need to adhere to COVID-19 restrictions to protect the people who fought for the independence and to build the Serbian nation. So looking at those two examples, COVID-19 could theoretically be framed as a security threat to anything or anyone. All we know for sure is that it's a tangible threat to particularly vulnerable people, but its security interpretations aren't limited because security as a concept isn't limited to particular groups.
I think if I may kind of like interrupt you here, there's conceptually, I think there is need to kind of like a global need to come up with a universal definition for like who COVID-19 is a security threat for. You will find, like you have said, different perspectives think that differently. But when we have a global issue, like the way terrorism was kind of like heavily contested, some people saw that terrorism was attached to a particular faith. Others actually thought maybe a particular group. So maybe a freedom fighter in his own perspective will be kind of like labeled as a terrorist by whoever is actually oppressing him, maybe, or he wants to.
In a sort of similar vein to the analogy that you're making, the way that I've always thought of it as, if you want to use like an analogy from the traditional sort of military-centric security concepts, if you're a soldier in a battlefield and you see a tank coming over the hill, is that a threat to you? And I'll ask you both: do you think that tank is a threat?
To me, usually yes.
Yeah. Well, surely doesn't it depend on who's driving the tank?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm scared nonetheless. So,
I mean, it's intimidating in either case, but whether or not something poses a threat to you is based upon your subjective relationship with that issue. So again, when we say who is COVID-19 a threat to, anyone who perceives it to be a threat to them is the answer. Even if it doesn't necessarily pose a tangible health risk to them because they're not in a particularly vulnerable group, they can still feel threatened by it. And if you apply that logic to, say, the system of nation states, they can apply that threat logic to anything, whether, as in the UK, it's a threat to the NHS, or in Serbia's case, it's a threat to the abstract nation of the Serbian nation state.
I think bringing that back to home here in the UK, at local level and national level, we found the debate that certain communities were actually responsible for spreading the disease, the virus. And also there was a counter argument which said, no, it's not actually those communities' fault. It's actually the social injustice that those communities find themselves in, like poor housing, overcrowded housings, poverty, and very much disadvantage. All of this could be like, there is still kind of like a divide on, whose perspective, from whose perspective is COVID-19 either a threat or a concern.
Yeah.
You agree?
That relates in terms of interpretations of security about empowering individuals to then overcome things like poverty, which are significant issues to large parts of the population. But then security and social justice are two separate things which have an interesting interplay. And a lot of people would argue, and on a personal level, I agree, addressing these issues would be beneficial, not just for the combating COVID-19, but also just for equality in society as a whole. But that doesn't necessarily make it a security issue.
Just to round up a question that you said, you talked about Dominic Raab and his view on public health and economic and social activity, and you wrote about this as well. It didn't. I can tell from your reading, from what you wrote, is you're trying to be non-biased and not provide any certain view of your own. but if do you perceive that there's more of a threat on the general public health or the economic and social activity? I understand you said earlier you're not really communicating it based on economic activities or social activities. But just to round it up as a question, what do you feel the biggest threat that comes out of COVID-19? Is it actually the over securitization of the nation, or do you feel that it's just in general the lack of thereof?
So I don't necessarily think that you can unpackage the two, because it's the threat of COVID-19 that requires restrictions, and it's then restrictions which have the negative impact on the economy. So I think it's more a case of what your risk threshold is. So the longer that we have COVID-19 restrictions in place, there is an increased likelihood of a negative impact on the economy. And a negative impact on the economy will have long-term effects on livelihoods and also public services such as the NHS and education, which won't improve the issues when it comes to social justice that Mohammed was just mentioning. So I think both are major issues, and I'm glad that I'm not the one that has to make a decision on what our risk threshold is.
Nice. Okay, we're going to our maybe final question, main question. How can the tension between security and liberty that surrounds the securitization of COVID-19 be resolved?
When an issue becomes securitized, it has certain connotations. It justifies exceptional measures we wouldn't accept in day-to-day politics, and those exceptional measures might well infringe upon individual rights. The Patriot Act in the USA, for example, being a result of a securitization around terrorism, but also infringing on individual rights. But also related to securitization, if an issue can go through a process to become a security threat or be perceived as a threat, it can also be desecuritized, brought back into the realm of day-to-day politics. And when it comes to reconciling the infringement of rights as a result of COVID-19 restrictions, what I think we need to do is keep questioning the government as to how necessary these restrictions are, so that once COVID-19 is desecuritized, perhaps when the R rate is so low that it's no longer in the public consciousness, or maybe a vaccine's been developed, that any security measures that were infringing on individual rights are removed and these emergency powers are acquiesced and these rights restored once COVID-19 is securitized.
Do you think more intervention from the nation states is required in terms of preparing people's mindset for the sacrifice that they have to make on their liberties, given the seriousness of the COVID-19 and how lethal it can be?
Well, the challenge here is because different demographics and groups are impacted differently through the virus. So I know young people are being accused of spreading the virus, but they're also one of the groups that are less likely to be affected. So how do you, I mean, we talk about nation states, but nation states aren't homogenous entities. There's a lot of diversity and variety within nation states. So the question is, how do you securitize an issue for a whole nation where actually there are subgroups within that nation with differing values and ideals that you need to invoke? And how do you maintain that over time? And that's not something I necessarily have the answer to. And when it comes to making speeches that invoke security, I think a securitizing actor, these social elites, can have lots of facilitating conditions. They can draw upon history and historical narratives that are broadly accepted. They can play on things which exist in the popular consciousness, but I don't think that's ever going to be applicable to the whole nation state in all of its diversity.
You talked earlier about the Patriot Law Act, which with its limitations, such as, for example, you can't really leak any information, even if it's for the purpose of helping the government. And I understand you wrote a little bit about Tony Blair. In his time, I think there was a lady called Catherine Gunn who leaked some information regarding how the war in Iraq, because I understand you wrote about the war in Iraq as well. She wrote about how the war in Iraq was kind of a decision made by the United Nations. However, it was enforced by the United States and the United Kingdom, who teamed up together in order to control the decision over the United Nations final say, whether to go to war with Iraq or not. And nonetheless, the decision was made prior to them going to war with Iraq and prior to the agreement. And it was proven through secret documents that Catherine Gunn has let out. So my question is, do you think, so there is different types of securitization, which you talked about, and one of them is securitization for control. Do you think the COVID-19 is being used in the UK or in Serbia as a securitization purpose for control? Or do you think it's used mainly to help the public, the NHS, and it's just looked at as an issue for the public health?
Okay, so when I talk about securitization for control, it doesn't necessarily mean that the perceived issue or the perceived threat within that securitizing move is being used to control the population in some sort of hypnotic sense, or you don't have a evil genius doctor saying, I will control the population. What I think when we talk about securitizing for control, it's about taking control of that community to address the perceived issue or the security issue that's being presented to the public. In the case of COVID-19, it's taking control in the sense of deterring behavior that spreads the virus. I think where that gets confused is where at the same time you have the government saying, don't go out spreading the virus, but do go out shopping. And that's where the distinction between security and economics becomes blurred. And people then get confused as to what they should be doing. And arguably then the securitizations for control get more overt because the behavior that the securitizing actors are trying to prevent is happening because of that confusion.
The thing is, some, people are concerned that their rights will be infringed because governments will take advantage of the current situation and the magnitude of the COVID-19 impact. And therefore, they think that the state power will be increased while at the expense of their rights. Do you think that's a legitimate concern? Or?
So I think it's a legitimate concern because, as I said earlier, security does entail exceptional measures that we wouldn't accept in day-to-day politics, and those measures might infringe individual rights and liberties. And for example, we have a right to assembly, but we're being told we can't gather in groups of more than 6, which is then a limit on that right to assemble in groups of more than 6. And whether or not you accept that as a, let's say, temporary limitation on your rights to assemble is based on whether or not you see the securitization of COVID-19 as legitimate. And if the securitization was successful for the nation as a whole, then there wouldn't be people complaining about not being able to gather in groups of 6, which links back to that confusion I mentioned earlier, where some people are actually falling in line with the view that we need to protect the economy, and that being the precedent over COVID-19, and seeing that the right to gather shouldn't be infringed because gathering, let's say, a venue is also economically beneficial. So whether or not it's acceptable depends on how you see that securitization.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of the program.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, for co-hosting this show with me. Thank you.
Anytime. It was a pleasure to speak to you, Lewis. And I hope we can talk more in the future about it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mohammed, as well.